Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
The legislative session is underway, and lawmakers want to address tax reform, crime, and salary raises for teachers. We'll talk about these issues on this episode of New Mexico Now. Hi, I'm Anthony Moreno. Welcome to our first episode of New Mexico Now for 2018. Joining us in studio is Walt Rubel, editorial page editor of the Las Cruces Sun-News, and Fred Martino, director of content at KRWG. Thank you both very much for joining us. Republicans in Washington were able to pass a major tax reform bill, and we are still trying to understand how that may impact New Mexico. Meanwhile, some lawmakers here in the land of enchantment have been pushing for years for tax reform within our state. There have been many different proposals, from bringing back the food tax to taxing internet sales to address this. Now, one thing that may be missing from the conversation is how tax breaks play a role. Last fall, the New Mexico State Auditor's Office released a report on tax breaks in New Mexico. The Government Accountability Report on Understanding Tax Choices stated that 27% of tax breaks in the state come from multiple extractive industries, while only 25% comes from GRT tax breaks. Now, when this report was released in September, the state auditor's office announced that New Mexico gave away over $1 billion worth of tax breaks without comprehensive reporting. Out of 180 tax breaks that were reported, 23 had no data available. Now, as we all know, New Mexico lawmakers have spent $400,000 trying to understand how much tax policy may affect the different deductions and so forth here within the state and in our policy currently. Walt, is it probably important for lawmakers to really understand how much information or how much data is not being reported before they start talking about policy?
Understanding certainly is the starting point. Anything you're going to try to do in terms of changes and reform, obviously you have to understand what you're dealing with before you can even start with that. But it has been piling on for so many years that I don't know. If you say that we have to wait to reform it before we get a complete understanding, I don't think you'll ever reform it, because I just don't think, I think they've done their study. I think they will understand it as well as they probably ever will. Having said all that, I don't think there's going to be a big reform bill in this session for a couple reasons. One, you mentioned the federal bill, which I don't think anybody fully understands yet how that's going to impact, both revenue to the state and each individual taxpayer. And so I think to me it would be logical to say we're going to hold off on state changes until we fully understand what that change is going to be. And the other thing is just a 30-day session. If you don't have agreement going into the session, and they don't, it's just very hard with all of the other things that they have to do, budget being number one, to hammer out something in that short of time, especially when there are such big disagreements on fundamental issues. It's just hard for me to see that happening this session.
Fred, when you're able to take a look at that report and hear that data on the tax breaks, what were some of the questions that came to your mind?
Well, this is so fascinating, Anthony, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, if you look at this, all of our discussion revolves around the gross receipts tax, but former auditor Tim Keller pointed out that that's only about a quarter of our total tax breaks, as you said, about $1 billion. And for one sector of our economy, the extractive industry, mining, gas, and oil, that one sector takes up even more than all the other GRT breaks, 27%. Very, very great article recently in the Santa Fe New Mexican. They looked at campaign donations to the state legislature since October. And it was about $500,000 to the state legislature just since October. Almost all of those donations came from oil and gas, about $183,000 from Chevron, $80,000 from Occidental, $73,000 from ConocoPhillips, and $66,000 from Devon Energy. This is, really something that needs to be part of the dialogue, and quite frankly, it just simply isn't. We're only talking about GRT because right now, that's really the only discussion that's happening in Santa Fe. Right. But when you look at these numbers, there's certainly another discussion that could be had.
Well, I want to ask you, you brought up it's a 30-day session. Right. There's not a lot of time. But is there enough time to really get this conversation started on addressing this issue?
I think it's been, as you mentioned, it's been something they've been wrestling with for years. Most lately, it's been Jason Harper and Bill McCamley in the House side who have really tried to, I know the two of them were working collaboratively for months before last year's session. And they never did come to agreement, I think, because there are real big differences in how you fix it and who you help and who you don't hurt. And to be frank, I think they just had different priorities. Bill McCamley, and this is another thing that I think will hurt the process, is him leaving the House. He's going to run for auditor next year. So somebody else will have to take that lead negotiator spot on the Democratic side if Jason Harper is going to come to some kind of compromise with a Democrat. So that's another thing going against it this year. But what I was going to say is I think Bill's primary concern is making sure that poor people don't get hurt in any kind of reform. Jason Harper's primary concern is small businesses and trying to reduce the burden on them. And so they go into the process seeking different outcomes and different results. And there are just so many of these different special exemptions targeted at every industry in the state. Every legislator up there has a dozen of them that are in their district that they don't want to see go away. And so, in my opinion, you either get rid of them all at the one time and start over, because trying to go through and pick the good ones from the bad ones, I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Well, Harper was quoted in New Mexico in Depth earlier this year as saying, I'm going to do a more scaled down approach. He was quoted as saying that there was an opportunity last year to address this policy. You had people just elected, you had the governor in her second term, and he said, if I quote it right, they had the perfect storm to be able to address it. So did lawmakers miss out on an opportunity to really do something about this last year?
That didn't make any sense to me, the part about the governor. And that was why I think they missed out last year, was the governor didn't get on board until maybe the last week, the last 10 days of the session, and it was too late by then. And the other problem, to be honest, is this legislature has been trying to get the governor to move on taxes for 8 years now, especially the last 2 years with all of the budget cuts. And there's a lot of frustration there. And so, I just get the sense that Democrats, especially in the legislature, are saying, well, we'll write it out this year. We'll have a new governor next year. We'll try to get it done then.
Well, and we can't forget there was a $400,000 study of what effect would occur if you change GRT, and the tool from that $400,000 study is not ready yet. And quite frankly, to spend that money and not have all the data, there's an argument to be made that you need to wait. I mean, especially when you consider that there was a one big tax break during the Martinez administration, a corporate tax break, and some argue that has had a major damaging effect to the
Sure.
finances of New Mexico. And we see that in a variety of ways, most notably the fact that there haven't been even cost of living adjustments
Right.
each year for employees. There may be, it looks like, an adjustment this year for the first time in a while.
Well, and
So-
that was the bill that was passed in the last seconds of the session.
Yeah.
Some would say after the clock had struck noon. And,
Right.
yeah, no, you're right. And the timing was horrible because right after they passed that, the recession came, and you know, the state has never recovered financially.
Now, one of the other things, New Mexico In Depth quoted State Senator John Arthur Smith as saying there probably won't be any type of tax reform without the food tax being involved or bringing back.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that, Walt? Is that pretty much, something that has to be in play in order for this conversation to continue?
I don't think it has to. From John Arthur Smith's point, it does, and I understand his thinking. I was covering the legislature when they passed that, and their calculations were just wildly off. It was supposed to be revenue neutral, and it hasn't been close. The reason for that has been changing in buying habits. We still buy our food at the grocery store, where we pay GRT tax. We buy all our other stuff, well, not all our other stuff, but a lot of other stuff online. And that is one thing I do think could get through this year is an internet tax. I think there is agreement on that. So I don't see anything comprehensive, but I think that could get through. But on the food tax, they passed that intending it to be revenue neutral, and it has come so far short of that that every year as the guy who is the main budget maker, John Arthur Smith, is looking at how many millions of dollars short we have come to what we were supposed to get in that. And I'm sure it rankles him, and I'm sure he wants to try to find a way to restore that. And I've also seen data that shows that it hasn't helped poor people as well as it was intended to. So there may be, even though that's counterintuitive, it certainly is to me, there may be an argument to be made there when you look at the data.
Well, as it looks like, we probably will be discussing this in future episodes of New Mexico Now as this conversation continues. Moving on, Governor Susana Martinez continues to push for tougher crime laws, saying in a transcript of first day of the state address, quote, "We also need a 3 strikes law with real teeth, and those who kill police officers, congressional officers, or children should absolutely face the death penalty," end quote. Democratic State Representative Damon Ellie of Corrales said in a guest column to the Santa Fe New Mexican earlier this month that it was time to use 0.5% of the state permanent fund to set up a public safety fund. The statistics are out there. This seems like something that may be a possible bipartisan issue. It seems like Democratic lawmakers are trying to address this issue as well as the governor. The FBI statistics obviously are very telling, as New Mexico ranks as at the top as far as like violent crime, property crime, some major raises there. I'm curious, how much of the conversation is going to be towards the recent bail reform rules that took effect here?
A lot. There will be a lot of discussion around that. The district attorneys haven't been happy with how that's played out. And I think there's general agreement that there is room for reform on that. On the bigger issue, I want to push back just a little bit when you say that New Mexico has this huge crime problem, because Las Cruces doesn't.
Right.
Southern New Mexico doesn't. It's Albuquerque. And Albuquerque absolutely does have a huge crime problem. And I covered the legislature, so I know that when Albuquerque has a problem, the state gets to join in the solution. That's just the way it is. I think there will be some agreement for more funding for the courts, more funding for police, more funding for probation. That's what Damon Ely's trying to put through. But he's trying to tap into the same permanent fund that people are for pre-K, and we're going to get to that in the next segment. But you have, two different legislators trying to tap into the same fund for 2 different purposes. And I don't know if that is going to happen. But just on the bigger picture, There will be some crime bills passed for sure. I think there's some sympathy for crimes dealing with children. Those always tend to do better. But in terms of bringing back the death penalty, that's not going to happen. The governor wants immunity from lawsuits for police officers. I don't think that's going to happen. You know, there will be some things, but I don't think the governor or her supporters will come out of this thinking that they've really done enough to address crime, at least from the perspective of Albuquerque and the people that live there.
And Walt, you mentioned Representative Illy. He, in a column, really tried to raise awareness on this, that this is a funding issue, that if you want to address this issue of crime, we need funding adjustments. In his column, he points out that the Sandoval County Detention Center has a hard time as it is with corrections officers trying to maintain staffing. And he says part of the reason for that is starting pay for corrections officers there is $13.25 an hour. Certainly, this is a problem in many state jobs, that the pay is becoming less and less competitive. When Walmart announces they're paying $11 an hour as starting pay, and you have folks working in a corrections department in one of the most challenging jobs you can imagine, making only a little more than that, not surprising that staffing is an issue. And he does have a solution here, as you pointed out. 0.5% of state permanent funds would be $100 million a year. That's a lot of money to address a really serious problem in terms of pay for some of our law enforcement.
It is. I just question the source, and I like I said, there will be, I think, more demands made on that permanent fund coming from education, and I don't know if it can support paying for both.
Absolutely, and this is his statement. We should point that out. That this is we need to know the numbers, just like we do with taxes.
Right.
We need to know, in fact, yes, that $100 million a year won't damage the permanent fund. He's saying no, it won't.
Right.
But we need some proof of that. Right?
And you know, we went into the session last year having to pass an emergency for the judiciary, just so that they would have enough money that they could pay jurors. And so our courts are severely underfunded. They have been for a long time. We have been due for an extra judge in our judicial district, the 3rd District, for years. I know a couple years ago, Fernando Macias went up and really lobbied hard for that, but wasn't able to get it. So there's no question that we do need to put more money into the criminal justice system. But I think when it comes to any bills that are going to end up with a lot more people being put into jail, being put into that system, that's where I think there's going to be a lot of resistance.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with the recent bail rules that took effect, that's lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were concerned as well on that and had different perspectives on that. So I'm kind of curious, with 2018 being an election year, is it kind of up for grabs? I mean, which party's going to be tougher on crime or control the conversation on crime?
No question to me. If you are a Democrat in the Albuquerque area, that is going to be a tough one for you. You're going to have to go along with the governor on some of these issues, because if I were living in Albuquerque, I would demand that they pass some of these laws. So I get that. And one thing quickly I wanted to say on bail reform, and that is just that we shouldn't forget that the change has done what it was intended to do, and that was to make sure that people who are poor are not sitting in county jails only because they don't have $500 to pay the bond. So it has accomplished that. What we need to do a better job is making sure that people who are dangerous are being able to be held, and it's not overly burdensome on the DAs to get that done.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the next topic. Lawmakers are presenting their plans for more money for teachers this year. New Mexico in Depth recently reported on a joint education committee hearing last week where PED officials presented their budget that included 2% increase across the board salary increase for teachers, along with bonuses for exemplary teachers, while the Legislative Finance Committee has proposed to raise base salaries by $2,000, bring level 1 teachers to $36,000, level 2 to $44,000, and level 3 to $54,000. Now, I guess there's also a side note to that if teachers have already been brought up to those levels, they won't see an increase, but there is an increase in a proposed increase in cost of living adjustments from what I get. So in this 30-day session, much of the focus goes towards the budget, but do we have a solid chance? We talked about the land grant permanent fund. Does this seem like the best opportunity or the best chance that fund may be tapped?
Oh yeah, I think
sources?
so. I do think so. And I've changed my position a little bit on this as well. I came from a family of savers, and I tend to think you don't eat your seed corn, that kind of thing. But the argument has been made to me by Bill McCamley and others that when you look at neighboring states, they are spending and investing their money, and they're doing better. So we have all of this money that we're keeping in the bank account that we're not using to help give our kids a head start, for one thing. And is that really serving us well? You can say that because our budget is so dependent on oil and gas and that is so volatile that it does make sense maybe for us to have a little bit more in the bank than our neighbors do. But I think the argument certainly can be made for an extra 1%, an extra 1.5%, and that not really eating into the body of the fund. And so I think there will be, as always, it has to get through John Arthur Smith and the Senate Finance Committee. And in the past, that's where these bills have always stalled. He seems to be a little bit more soft on that this year, although I haven't spoken to him on that directly. So that's the committee to look for. If they can get it through that committee, then it will pass.
Fred, thoughts on how these proposals to raise salaries for teachers can impact the education of New Mexico students?
Absolutely. This is interesting. This year, as we've heard, the governor wants to raise the minimum starting pay for teachers from $34,000 to $36,000. And there's also a proposal to have a cost of living adjustment for state employees, including teachers. But again, if you look at the numbers, this is the classic example of what happens when you have a long-term situation where you do not have cost of living adjustments. $2,000 simply doesn't do it. If you look at the numbers, we have a great example here. Las Cruces Public Schools, starting pay for teachers, $34,000 a year. Just down the road, El Paso Independent School District, $48,300. Not even in the ballpark in terms of being competitive. And so if you raise it to 36, you're still $12,000 less than a nearby school district that, by the way, also doesn't have state income tax if you live in Texas. So it's even less competitive than it appears on the surface. This is not just about education, right? I mean, we just heard the Associated Press reporting that our state veterans hospital in Tier C could not open a new dementia unit that's already been built because they don't have enough nursing assistants to open it up. By the way, those nursing assistants make $16,000 a year. So is it a surprise that they can't find enough nursing assistants for that unit? Not surprising to some people. So to allow no cost of living adjustments for years on end results in long-term serious damage that in some cases can become a crisis. And so that's something that you have to look at. And I think part of it, Walt, I don't know if you agree with me on this, part of it is that our language isn't even right on this. You've noticed I've used the term cost of living adjustment. Right. But the narrative in news stories and by politicians is raises. Yeah. In fact, this is not about raises because cost of living adjustments simply ensure that you're treading water. That in other words, your salary, your buying power from your salary doesn't drop, which is what has happened here and in other places around the country for the last decade.
And I would add one thing on top of all of that, and that is that the big fight is going to be over the issue of merit pay. The governor wants to tie these races to how well the teachers do on the evaluations. And the evaluations are so tied to the standardized tests that the teachers, all the teachers I talk to say, listen, we got no problem being evaluated. We want to be evaluated by people we respect and who understand the profession. We don't want to be evaluated based strictly, and it's not strictly, but have it so much based on this standardized test that they feel, I think rightfully so, that they have so little control over.
Yeah. One thing that does make me a little curious is how much do you think the lawsuit the state is facing in District 1 on funding education is going to play in this whole conversation of educational funding in the state?
I don't think we'll know until we get an answer. I don't think it will affect this year. I really don't, because we are at the point now where they have made final arguments, and now they've got a few weeks to make rebuttals. And so that process will still be taking place while the legislature's in session. So whatever the final impact will be, I think we'll know when we get a verdict.
Yeah, and that's an interesting lawsuit. It'll be very interesting to see what the decision is on that, and it raises that larger issue that in more and more of these cases, when we have a failure in terms of political solutions to things, it's going to the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just in education, it's across the board. And so it just reminds us all that as we discuss these issues, again, the importance of politics, and we're reminded that politics is part of how we choose judges.
Right. Well, and that's, hey, all with this, a lot what this show is about. I want to thank you very much for joining us on this episode of New Mexico Now. Walt Rubel with the Las Cruces Sun News, Dr. Fred Martino with KRWG, thank you very much. And we want to thank you for joining us for this episode of New Mexico Now. Remember, you can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at KRWG for the latest news and programming announcements. Also, we'd like to hear your story ideas and topics for this program and others. You can always email us at feedback@nmsu.edu. Thanks for joining us for this episode of New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno.